For the last few years, I've been promoting what I call the judgment-based approach to entrepreneurship, which articulates entrepreneurship as taking control of resources, productive assets, and combining them in different ways, deploying them under conditions of uncertainty in an attempt to earn profits and to avoid losses. So by its very nature, the way I see it, entrepreneurship is not just about coming up with ideas. It's not just about discovering opportunities in the environment. It's about action. It's about taking action in the world, putting assets at risk in order to try to achieve some goal. We know a lot about how entrepreneurs think. We know about how entrepreneurs plan. We know a little bit about how they try to anticipate future events, but we don't know as much about what determines successful outcomes from unsuccessful ones. And we have a lot of models of formal decision-making, we have scenario planning and so forth, but ultimately, what is it about the entrepreneur as a person or the entrepreneurial team or the context that makes some people more successful than others at dealing with this fundamental, radical Knightian uncertainty that surrounds us? We have insights from other disciplines, organization and strategy and finance and so forth, that help us to understand some of the factors that are most often associated with successful entrepreneurial action. How does this tie into cognition and ways that we think about uncertainty? Those are issues that we're just beginning to understand and for which we need a lot more research effort. As far as future research directions, there are several different ways to go. Some people are interested in kind of understanding what successful entrepreneurial judgment really is from a cognitive point of view, from a behavioral point of view. I think that's a potentially fruitful line of research. But remember, at the end of the day, entrepreneurial judgment is a kind of decision-making about the future that is to some extent intuitive and tacit and latent. And by definition, it's a kind of decision-making that cannot be modeled as a set of formal procedures or formal decision rules. So I think there are some limits in our use of science to understand the cognitive essence of entrepreneurial judgment. So another strand is to look at more at the macro level, look at resources, look at firm characteristics, look at markets and institutions, and say under what circumstances can we expect that people who have better entrepreneurial judgment, who are more successful at anticipating the uncertain future, will thrive and will succeed and will be able to accumulate more resources. So a lot of it is about sort of how judgment is manifest in the market, or how different kinds of market systems respond to judgment. That's a different line of research from trying to understand, what judgment is and how do we make it better, how do we teach it, and so forth. There's a lot of interest nowadays in things like artificial intelligence and machine learning. Can machines engage in strategic thinking? Can machines make entrepreneurial decisions? Really, what I'm interested in is more kind of the boundaries of what things we can task to machines or algorithms and what things we have to retain for ourselves. And, in my conceptualization of entrepreneurship is about kind of the residual or final decision authority. It's not about day-to-day decisions, which can be delegated from an entrepreneur to a manager or an assistant or a consultant or a machine or a computer. Right? So it's sort of figuring out what are the decisions that only entrepreneurs who own and control and have residual decision authority about resources, what are the decisions that only they can make, right? So I can task some, I can give some jobs to my subordinate, or I can hire a consultant, but ultimately I, as the owner of these resources, have to make the final decisions about, well, whether to take the consultant's advice, which consultant to hire, and which consultant not to hire, and so forth. It's this kind of residual decision authority that is really tied up with notions of ownership and entrepreneurship. I have another project looking at the characteristics of good owners, and under what circumstances does ownership, do ownership claims flow to those with the highest levels of what we call ownership competence. So I think links between entrepreneurship and ownership and governance, that's a very fruitful research direction, which is just sort of beginning to be understood.
the thinking is that there is a perception that because of communications and transportation that where you locate your business doesn't matter. And actually, what we've observed over the years is that actually, especially since the publication of this book, The Death of Distance, in 1996, in that time, we've actually seen a tremendous increase, not decrease, in the concentration of businesses and industries in particular locations. So, we think that somehow being freed from having to be near our customers, entrepreneurs are still finding it necessary to be located around groups of talent, say labor pools or resources, and even are being influenced by opportunities that are concentrated regionally. So, you asked me about the current state of the literature. Here's a couple things we do know. We do know that from the literature that location conditions will affect the startup, the formation of startups. So it would influence the kinds of opportunities that people are likely to recognize. It's going to affect the kinds of resources that might be available to launch a venture. And because a lot of times entrepreneurs, one definition of entrepreneurship is, of course, the corralling of resources outside of our controls in order to be able to launch a new organization or to act entrepreneurially. But we also know that because of location conditions, that different regions will have different effects on the prospects for survival, growth, and the evolution of new businesses as they evolve into mature organizations. So there is actually not a lot of elements of entrepreneurial action that are not affected by geographic location. But I would say it's principally through two things. One is the resources that are available to act entrepreneurially, and also the opportunities that people are likely to recognize. Those are also going to be influenced by local conditions.
So that's a great question, right? What is entrepreneurial action? And I think this is one of the interesting developments in the field, that it's become almost a token phrase that's used symbolically within our theoretical work, but hasn't been rigorously developed. And so in my mind, and in my approach, entrepreneurial action is a specialized form of social action. And so it is a process where entrepreneurs translate, engage with aspects of a dynamic environment. So they're essentially filtering or translating what's happening in the world around them, and then they're taking action, right? They're engaging in strategic entrepreneurial modes of action to innovate, to create new value, to create the future goods and services we talk about in some of our foundational work. But in the end, these actions create a special form of a transformational mechanism. So these actions basically transform or change society around them. Again, I think the unique and fun aspect of entrepreneurial action theory is it's emerging that in most cases, social action theory is built around an engagement with the environment as it currently exists. And so to some degree, there's a translational piece that, you're reading the environment and you're trying to see kind of what is, and then there's some degree of human agency and the flexibility or alternative modes of action that you can take in response to that. But entrepreneurship is unique in that, again, we talk about future goods and actions. And so it's translating not what is, but it's translating what possibly might be. And so it's taking a look into the future. And so there's a speculative intentionality, I think, behind entrepreneurial action that is different in our field from other forms of social action or action theory across the social sciences. And so I think that future-oriented piece, where we're not, again, thinking about what is, but we're thinking more about what's possible or what possibly could be, is a unique aspect of how our field is tackling these questions. To take entrepreneurial action again from a maybe a symbolic or a kind of a black box construct in a model to something that has some theoretical rigor that actually provides, predictive validity and can guide and shape how we do research. So I think part of the part of the process is going to be specifying an actual theoretical framework. And so I think understanding what, the antecedents, consequences, and then all the mediating and contextual moderators, the temporal aspects of a theory, I think all of that is needing to be specified. And I always think about theory building kind of through a 4-dimensional lens. And there's, the construct piece, so the single dimension of what are the key constructs. There's the causality piece. How do those constructs shape what kind of actions or what kind of consequences flow out of, those initial constructs being present. Then there's the contextual piece, right, of boundary conditions and moderators, things that shape and act the process. And then what I call contingency. So most of the time, historically, we think about contingencies as contingency theory. So, they're contextual moderators, but I kind of think about it from a philosophical perspective of contingencies or future contingencies. And so it's things that happen within the temporal flow of action. So I think there's a huge need for us to build rigor across those 4 dimensions. So entrepreneurial action moves into, becomes an actual theory that has some substance, again, predictive validity. And then I think some of the problems within that are, again, the future-oriented aspect of it, I think are critical. Again, entrepreneurial action research draws a lot on theories of human agency. I think human agency, within the way that we think about it, oftentimes is shaped around, an idea of freedom of action or emancipation, so the ability of people to translate or transcend, the dictates of an environment. But I think agency takes on a more rigorous form when it's applied within entrepreneurial action theory. And so again, it's not necessarily freedom of action per se or only. It also has to do with, again, that transformational piece. And so to me, that's one of the major problems. But it happens to also be one of the major problems in social theory, right? So how do we take micro level actions and translate that into structural change? Jeff's recent paper at ATP is a great example of, I think, scholars that are tackling this question, the agentic components of entrepreneurial action theory. So to me, that's an incredibly important problem, for us to tackle and to look, a lot of the work we're doing right now is around this idea of constrained agency. And so to what extent do these structural forces shape or, constrain aspects of the entrepreneur being able to take action? But then what are the generative pieces where the entrepreneur, again, translates that into some, clever way to move around or to take what other people see as an obstacle and translate it into an opportunity. And so, that kind of fundamental problem of human agency, I think, is critical.
If you look at early work on imprinting and entrepreneurship, it focused on founding conditions that influenced the venture. So, what was going on in the environment at the time that the firm was founded, those kinds of questions. And then the initial decisions that entrepreneurs make, how those initial decisions kind of persist over time as the venture progresses. More recently, you're starting to see work where scholars are looking much more at the individual level and at the decision level that really looks at how those kinds of decisions influence the entrepreneur and influences individuals within the organization over time. So, for example, a couple of papers I've been involved with, one really looked at what we called sources of imprint and how it influences the decision-making process over time. And in some cases, those sources of imprint would go back to the very early stages of the entrepreneur's life, not necessarily the venture, but in many cases pre-venture. In another project, we looked at how this imprinting process could actually be used or conceptualized in the sense of how an entrepreneur might imprint an individual within the organization to take on a valued role. And then that would free the entrepreneur up from enacting that role and going to do other things to help the venture grow. It's really looking at kind of the macro and the micro parts of the entrepreneurial process and really addressing entrepreneurial actions, both in the sense of taking steps to start a venture, what entrepreneurs do once the venture is already created, but also things at the organization that the venture is doing as well, those kinds of actions. But the one thing I have that I've kind of as an open question for me anyway, is the idea of entrepreneurial inaction. And when we talk about entrepreneurial inaction, some early work, 2017 JBV, that Matt Wood was the lead author on, really looked at this sense of the decisions that I make in terms of which opportunities I decide to pursue and not pursue might actually impact the opportunities that I later decide to pursue for a particular venture. And what we found were that the antecedents to inaction were essentially the same as the antecedents to action, but the outcomes were very different. But that was really just in the context of opportunity evaluation. As we move beyond that context, suggests that there may be some very big differences in terms of what precedes entrepreneurs' inactions versus what precedes their actions. And so whether or not we use an imprinting lens for that research or not, this idea of looking at a little bit more temporal perspective and kind of what happens before actions are taken and what the outcomes of those decisions and those actions are, I think there's kind of a fruitful space here for future research.
From my perspective and based on the literature and the work that I've done, I think of entrepreneurial action as a purposeful and consequential human activity that entrepreneurs engage to introduce something new to the world. So following that kind of definition of opportunity about introducing something new to the world, and it's about pursuing that. And so I tend to think of entrepreneurial action as a process more so than just a single event. And I think of it as certainly unfolding under conditions of uncertainty, which is a precondition for entrepreneurial action. And as entrepreneurs formulate their visions of what could be, what the future might look like, and how they can shape other actors into creating new patterns of interaction, they don't know the outcomes of that. They don't know for sure what's going to happen. And so that condition of uncertainty is something that entrepreneurs have to deal with, which I think is, we know that, and we're working through that in the literature. But I think it has consequences for some of the future research directions. Focus on individuals, or what we would call enterprising individuals. But this also includes other stakeholders like investors, and particularly it involves interactions between stakeholders and entrepreneurs as they try to build consensus among stakeholders as they're trying to do something new. The way I think about it is that the literature has really progressed a lot in the last 10 years or so. We really know a lot more about this idea of entrepreneurial action, what drives it. It's really a robust stream of research at this point. And we've learned a lot about some of the cognitive dynamics around entrepreneurial action, how entrepreneurs think, what it is that drives them to act. And most of that work has really been focused on kind of the lead up to initial action. So what is that first action that entrepreneurs take? But we seem to know less about the types of action. So when we say entrepreneurial action, what action or is it that we're actually talking about? Are we talking about filing an LLC? Are we talking about signing a lease? What is it that we're talking about? And that's remained, I think, kind of abstract in the literature, although I think we're starting to make some traction in that direction. We really haven't thought as much about how entrepreneurial action unfolds as a series of either sequential or simultaneous actions instead of just a single act. And so I think that's kind of where the literature is. We know a lot about this kind of initial action or, startup action type of thinking. But beyond that, we really don't know much about how this stuff, unfolds. There are a couple of things, studies that my co-authors and I have contributed. One with Dave Williams and Will Drover on this idea of entrepreneurial inaction, if you will, where we find an inaction inertia effect. So, in some ways, many people talk about, starting a business or pursuing an entrepreneurial endeavor, but they don't really do it, so a lot of our students end up doing that. So this idea of inaction, I think, is something that is important. And I think entrepreneurs go through periods of inaction and action, and, what do those look like? What might drive those? So I think that's an interesting area of future research, is kind of considering the other side of the coin, the inaction side of the coin. But then mapping out this kind of sequential action, so this loop of, entrepreneurs acting, and if we take an enactment or creation kind of perspective to opportunity, the very act of engaging in pursuing entrepreneurship changes what happens. So they're constantly acting and reacting, but we're not really capturing that in our research, in part because it's difficult to do methodologically. But as we've thought about how would we do this, one of the things that has to really be mapped out is how we deal with the issue of time in entrepreneurial action. And so I have a recent paper with Renee Baker and Greg Fisher in AMR where we try to unpack this, and we specify initialization, pace, and chronology as some elements of time that impact entrepreneurial action. And so if we take something like pace, which is how long we define it as how long it would take to reach a key milestone, this is not just a background assumption in entrepreneurial action. It's actually a key lever for action. So if I think it's going to take too long for me to reach, break even, let's say, as a milestone, I'm not going to act. So it's not just that there's time and that, entrepreneurship unfolds over time. I mean, we know all those things, but we really need to move towards how does that actually manifest in the process as, measurable variables that make a difference on entrepreneurial action. And so something like pace and initialization, when are you going to first take action, are variables that we can, really take and operationalize and see how those things impact when entrepreneurs are going to, whether they're going to pursue their ideas or not. And I think that this is really important because it opens up the process, kind of black box of process around entrepreneurial action, that we know it's a process, we know it unfolds over time, but digging down into those things in ways that we can really unpack that and do empirical studies around that is very difficult. It's very challenging, but we're making a lot of progress. There's a lot of really smart people working on this, and each contribution, that's being made by scholars is really starting to add a piece of, a puzzle piece, and we're really starting to get a much better picture. So, with that, I think that's kind of where the literature is headed. There's still lots of opportunity for research on entrepreneurial action. There's still a lot that we don't know. I particularly encourage people to think about data sets or opportunities where they can collect data, either qualitative data, experimental data, particularly longitudinal data that, we can start to look at how some of these things unfold. That's the stuff that, I get excited about these days.
I've studied disability quite a bit, and the way I've studied it is together with scholars from disability studies. And so we take this perspective that disability is about the context. It's not an individual quality, a medical quality as such, but it's more about the environment and how the environment reacts to the person who is differently abled. So that's kind of a different take from some of the other research we've seen in entrepreneurship on disability. So with that in mind, and thinking of disability as a context for entrepreneurial action, the thing that I've focused a lot on are the barriers that this creates for individuals who are trying to engage in entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurial action, as we know, it's typically preceded by different kinds of processes where intention to act is being created. And so when we think of those processes and the barriers that are at work in there, sometimes we see that disability and other disadvantages as well that I've studied, they can prevent the intention from developing overall. And in some other ways, they can also be barriers that prevent intention from being realized into action. So your typical barriers that you can think of, resource barriers. There are groups of the population, and people with disabilities being one of them, that face huge barriers to resource access. And so that would be one example of a barrier that kind of prevents even those who have an intent to act from actually acting entrepreneurially. In terms of the future research directions, and this would be like the two last bullet points that I wrote here on the slide. So first of all, I think a lot of the research in this area has focused on the barriers themselves and how to overcome those barriers. So disability and the related issues would be barriers to overcome for individuals when they engage in entrepreneurial action. There's also other types of barriers like gender barriers that have been discussed and whatnot. So focus has overwhelmingly been on overcoming those barriers. And where I see the future research going more, and I hope it will go more, is to think more of those systemic solutions and the origins of those barriers in the first place, and how our research could answer questions that would help us better understand how those barriers could be removed or at least brought down a little bit for these different groups. Another thing about future research, if we think about barriers and the kinds of groups that we've studied, people with disabilities included, a lot of this research has been very focused still on Western societies. And in some other research that I've been engaged in, we're looking at adverse environments, countries where institutions are very fragile, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and whatnot. And then engaging or doing more research in places like that, where some of these assumptions about entrepreneurial action that we have simply are not the same. I think that's another way for future research to really contribute to entrepreneurial action.
The way I see entrepreneurial action, at least as it relates to the work that I do, is first of all, it's at the individual level of analysis. So I'm interested in looking at individual actors who invest in new ventures. Now that investment can be time, energy, real resources, other assets, financial assets or other. And so I'm talking about entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, whether they be starting their own new venture or working in an entrepreneurial capacity within their firm. Investors who inject money into new ventures, and these include VCs, angel investors, and a newer category of crowdfunders. You know, these I call these ordinary startup investors. I got a paper that I'm working on with some scholars at Indiana University that looks at these ordinary startup investors and what affects their decision making. And maybe we're going to talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. But it also trickles down to new venture employees, people who work in these new venture contexts. How are they affected by the differences that exist in a new venture as compared to an established firm? Especially one paper that I'm working on is the establishment of culture and how leaders influence that culture. So the entrepreneur, him or herself, how does that person influence the employees that decide to work in the new venture? And so that's how I view entrepreneurial action. It's individual level analysis, and it's those actors, entrepreneurs, investors, and employees. This is Weinberger et al., and it's 2018, I think, in Journal of Business Venturing. And it looks at sleep and its influence on creativity. And so they actually measure sleep using actigraphs and showing that less sleep leads to diminished creativity, which of course, when you're thinking about creativity, cognition plays a role as well, but this one is looking at a recovery lens, sleep as a recovery activity. And if you don't have the recovery that you need as an entrepreneur, then you have a hard time doing the creative things that you need to do to be innovative. And so that was an early paper, very seminal and influential on my work. I wrote a paper with Amanda Williamson and a few others that looks at sleep and its influence on high activation, both positive and negative affect. When you sleep better, you have higher sleep quality. Quality was the IV in that paper. Sleep quality was the IV in that paper. You then have higher positive affect, especially the higher activation positive affect, which then influences innovative work behavior. And we looked at entrepreneurs over 10 days and showed that over those 10 days within an entrepreneur, when that one entrepreneur had more sleep as opposed to less sleep on that day, they were more innovative in their job. And these are practicing entrepreneurs. I feel like those are a couple of very interesting papers about sleep. There's one by Chuck Mirnix and colleagues who looks at mindfulness and its influence on exhaustion. They also have a sleep variable in there too. So they're looking at the interplay between the practice of mindfulness. Can you overcome some of the sleep deficit? And they find that when you don't have enough sleep, it helps if you can be mindful. It helps diminish exhaustion. So I think mindfulness is an important variable to be looking at. There's a lot of research out there now that is thinking about experimentation and deploying experiments on entrepreneurship or on entrepreneurs using a sample of entrepreneurs. And I think that those are great. I employed an experimental ESM in a Journal of Business Venturing paper that I published on sleep and ideation activity and forming new beliefs about a venture. But Regan Stevenson at Indiana University just published an article in Academy Management Annals with a few co-authors about the promise of experimental design in entrepreneurship. And I think that's a good one that people could look at to say, hey, I want to look at individual level entrepreneurship and how can I deploy an experiment? He outlines a lot of different papers that do that and how it promises to, especially if you're using a randomized controlled trial, how it promises to establish causality. Because a lot of the research out there right now is just observational. It's like, okay, we saw this. We see that this characteristic has an effect on well-being or has an effect on creativity or has an effect on innovation. And I think that's really important work. I'm not downplaying it, and I've done some of that work myself. But these randomized controlled trials offer the possibility to establish causal relationships that can really teach us what's going on and for whom. I think one variable that is really interesting moving forward is well-being. I know there's a special issue in JBV on well-being. Uta Stefan has written a systematic review on well-being. There's a lot that we know about correlationally. Here are things that we find in conjunction with entrepreneurial well-being. And one of the things that I take away from that literature is that it's still not clear whether entrepreneurship is good for an entrepreneur's well-being or not. So that's somewhat paradoxical, right? Like there's some papers that say, yeah, being an entrepreneur, you have higher levels of well-being, greater autonomy, and it's a fantastic career. You have this feeling of mastery or mastering a subject and greater eudaimonic well-being. So on the one hand, it can be a great outcome, right? A higher well-being associated with being an entrepreneur. Okay. On the other hand, there's research that says that entrepreneurs don't have the opportunity to recover. And that's one of the reasons that I started writing about sleep, is because when I was running a company, I didn't feel like I had the opportunity to recover. And I have a family, so I didn't, if I'm going to spend time with my family and I'm going to do a whole lot of hours of work, I chose to let sleep suffer, right? Yeah. And so what are the consequences associated with that? So there's this paradoxical relationship between entrepreneurship and doing entrepreneurship, and whether it's good for people or not, good for the entrepreneur or not. And I think that that's a promising avenue for future research. I mentioned before, experiments have greater potential to explain the relationships between entrepreneurship and well-being.
Hello, my name is Trey Lewis, doctoral candidate at the University of Tennessee. I'm standing in for one of our originally scheduled panel experts, Dr. Melissa Cardin. She's the Haslam Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation, also at the University of Tennessee. I want to talk briefly about the role that emotions play in entrepreneurial action. I do want to say that I did not have the opportunity to confer with Dr. Cardin, so I want to be clear that the thoughts that I shared do not necessarily reflect her vantage point. Entrepreneurship often explores the role of emotion to address why entrepreneurs pursue the activities that they do, or as I'll talk about later, perhaps maybe why they don't, or how entrepreneurs generate resource support from various stakeholder groups. We also know that emotion explains the way, the timing in which entrepreneurs engage in tasks, and that the source of these emotions, thinking about passion in particular, is really deeply interrelated with an individual's identity, such that positive feelings can be experienced when they're engaging in tasks that are really core and meaningful to the self. Secondly, emotions have a source or target, which can be important for a better understanding of either emotion experienced by entrepreneurs or emotion that is perceived by important others. I see future work leveraging some of the recent work by scholars that has highlighted some of the source or targets of emotion relevant for entrepreneurship. For example, Melissa Cardin and her colleagues' 2017 JBVI that uncovered 6 major sources of passion that include sources such as passion for growth, passion for product, or passion for people, or even passion for a social cause. I think that work is really important because we may find that the emotion to action link may work very differently depending on the source of the emotion. Another example of this is Cacciati and colleagues' very recent 2020 JBV piece that is essentially a scale validation for entrepreneurial fear of failure. In the paper, they really deepen our understanding of fear of failure by offering several dimensions of fear It's associated with one's ability to fund the venture, viability of the idea, even the threat of one's social esteem if the venture fails, and the implications of their own financial security. Really interesting paper. And putting that all together, I see the work that leverages these various domains and sources of emotion can really help us to better understand why, when, and even under what conditions individuals take action across the entrepreneurial process. Admittedly, we know less about how emotions influence entrepreneurial inaction. We know that emotions such as fear, failure, and doubt can lead to inaction, but we lack explanations for how these emotions ebb and flow over time, thus influencing inaction. And we also yet to really understand the factors that help entrepreneurs overcome those emotions that inhibit inaction. The idea of further investigating inaction where individuals either consciously or subconsciously opt not to take action at various stages of the entrepreneurial process, I really think is fertile research ground. To date, our explanations of entrepreneurial inaction have really been limited to what I think of as economically rational explanations, whereby individuals cease action because they perhaps think an opportunity is no longer attractive or viable. But I'd argue that it is certainly possible that an individual may opt against taking action or even cease action because their emotions at any given time may inhibit them from doing so. So questions regarding the conditions under which individuals are inhibited by their emotions or overcome these emotions to take action can be fruitful, possibly providing an explanation as to why perhaps some people sustain action over time while others don't.